Hello. Okay. Can you hear me okay? Joe? Yes? Hi, everybody. My name is Kirsten Madden. I am here to talk a little bit about Robert Owen's contributions to cooperation. And so let me just get my screen up. And we're ready to go. Is my screen being shared? Joe, can you nod? Andrew, can you see my screen okay? Yeah, okay, great. Okay, so let's get going. So this topic is about taking villages from discord to harmony. What I'm going to cover mostly is Robert Owen's logic of cooperation. Robert Owen is an originating advocate in cooperation in 19th century English economic thought. And what I want to do today is cover the highlights of his fundamentals of cooperation. So I'm going to give very brief coverage to his biographical details. I'm going to focus on the section on fundamentals of Owen's cooperation. There I want to talk about what he means by cooperation. I want to explain the human being that his system assumes. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time on the underlying metaphysical analysis that supports Owen's cooperation and the social psychology that should pop out of that. Then what I want to do is turn to the list of claims that he provides for why people would want to cooperate in the first place. These will be from the individual perspective and also from the societal perspective. Then I'll turn a little bit to transition issues, describe his cooperative village, and then address at the very end, briefly cover the contradictions and the questions. Okay, I have a long presentation, and so I want to be really brief here. I'm just going to focus on Owen's practical experiments towards social harmony. So Robert Owen, back in the early 1800s, established took over the New Lanark textile mill. And basically what he did was he took a village that was in complete discord and he transformed it into a fairly peaceful, highly productive type of community. So the community went from lots of fights, lots of drunkenness, poor work ethic, problematic behaviors, children that had been brought in from orphanages that were being mistreated and so forth. And by the time that he leaves New Lanark, the place is quite successful and is also leading to 50% returns for its investors. So this was a successful case. He then starts to write up plans for a cooperative village, and he tries to institute these in New Harmony, Indiana, and in Queenwood, and those are all known as being dramatic failures. So what I want to do is get into the economic thought that he was working on over decades with regard to this cooperative structure that builds off of the success, but then never really gets realized after that. Okay, so Owen is following the basic ideas of the big thinkers of his time. This idea is that people are born with self-interest and they have the desire for happiness, and that is what's guiding all action. For Owen, though, he switches this idea around to really challenge the foundation of ideas about self-interest. He says the foundation of true self-interest is cooperation. In other words, to do everything that's feasible to support other people's well-being. So he defines cooperation, and super important as you're listening to me talk for the next 20 or so minutes, that we're all on the same page concerning what Owen means by cooperation. For Owen, cooperation is a cordial, other-centered working together by all for the benefit of each. Again, a cordial, other-centered working together by all for the benefit of each. This is supposed to be inspirational ideation for the individual, but it's also fundamentally an organizing principle for social institutions. So he writes in 1826, if it be desirable to introduce sincerity, to induce cordial love, to secure peace and goodwill, to improve intellectual and physical powers, to give habits and best habits and dispositions, to withdraw motives counteracting each other's well-being, then should it be proclaimed in language of genuine charity what human nature really is and what those circumstances are under which it alone can become either rational or happy. So, key for Owen's understanding of the human is plasticity. He writes in 1836, none are or ever or can be bad by nature. And this is a common theme in his thought. The education is always the business of the work of society and not of the individual. The individual is thus evidently a material of nature, finished and fashioned by the society in which it lives. In a nutshell, this plasticity idea is that socialization shapes beliefs and behavior. So think of a few parallels. If people are trained to link well-being with efficiency of production, then people are going to learn to be efficient in production and to promote this as the social ideal of progress. If people are trained to link well-being with the accumulation of wealth, then people are going to learn how to accumulate wealth, and they're going to promote that as the ideal of social progress. From Owen's perspective, both of those trainings are undermining well-being for the whole human being and for society generally. So what Owen is thinking is, why don't we train people to link cooperative benevolence to well-being? Okay, so plasticity is key in this system. What else is he offering in his human understanding of human beings? Well, first of all, really important for production processes, and how workers' well-being is reflected, is that the person is a compound of not one physical manifestation, but of three parts. The three-part person is physical, intellectual, and moral. And super important that I am taking a 21st century take on moral. What I'm focusing on here is the emotional, psychological, spiritual, and ethical components when I'm thinking of moral. For Owen, well-being requires harmonious coexistence for the individual across all three parts, no one part in domination to the other. Now, beyond the plasticity concept, Owen does see that people have some original faculties. The first two should be non-controversial. They're just the standard idea of attraction and aversion. People have an inclination to unite with that which supports well-being. They have an inclination to avoid that which brings ill-being. What's key for Owen, and is controversial for many people, is the next one, that Owen believes one of our original faculties is to benefit fellow creatures to the greatest possible extent, and this is core to his thought. And then we also have a love of truth. Just real quick, character is used a lot in his work. A character, that word is defined as being a specific set of feelings, preferences, beliefs, morality, will, intelligence, and talents that is unique to each individual. And remember, plasticity is core to this system. Character is formed for a person, not by a person. Okay, next up is the underlying metaphysical analysis that's supporting cooperation. Just want to explain why we're doing this. We're accepting Owen's premises that there's valuable untapped perspective and that these ideas actually hold together. What's interesting is I'd like to see how we could shape and figure out the full framework, because they provide a full framework for a political economy that's based on cooperation. So we're going to do just a little bit of the metaphysical analysis because I have way more that I want to cover than I have time available. Let's just work on the idea that the character is formed for a person, not by a person, because many people have problems with that idea. It's a major implication that comes out of it. Now, this slide is a bit overwhelming. The green and the blue come from two different sources about a decade apart, and they're performing the argument that underlies the character formation hypothesis. In a nutshell, what Owen is doing way back in 1826 is he's basically making some deductions from what I'm calling a subject-object dichotomy. So if a subject does an action on an object, the basic idea is that the subject cannot be the object. So let's apply that to Owen's terminology. He defines creation up in the top left of the slide as the combining of various ingredients. He defines the creator as the power that combines these ingredients into a compound. He defines a compound as anything created in the whole of creation, including particularly people, with no two compounds alike. So notice we've got creator, action, creation, on an object, a compound. So then he writes, the whole of creation is in perpetual movement. All things created are coming into compound existence, being formed, growing, existence, decomposed, or dying. Then the blue in the middle of the screen is where he's actually explaining this character formation hypothesis. And it's a neat little example. He says, suppose the organization at birth to be represented by A and the first circumstance acting upon it to be represented by B. A and B unite, making a compound represented, we will suppose, by C. Second circumstance influences the organization shall be called D, which then unites with the last compound C, making a new compound of character, which we will call E. The next external influence, which we will call F, must now make another compound, not, however, by uniting A and C, those are gone, lost forever, but with the last new compound, E, making together the fourth compound, which we denominate G. In this manner, the character of each individual undergoes a constant change. So this example is a neat example, and what it's leading us to is the last part of his 1826 point. So the rightmost green column, he writes, that which is created cannot form itself. Its qualities are not in any degree its own. It cannot possess merit or demerit for their formation. It can have no control in choosing the ingredients or in proportioning them to form the compound which makes it what it is. And unless prevented by some other power, it must exist and act according to its nature. So Owen deduces from this that a person is not, nor ever can become responsible for any peculiar person compound. If responsibility have any meaning at all, it applies solely to the power that creates it. And then he gives a really nice example of this. The human character, he writes, may be made so humane and be so directed that the matured man shall be compelled to feel considerable horror at accidentally injuring the limb of the smallest insect, or be made to experience the greatest pleasure and delight in first killing, afterwards roasting, and then eating one of his fellow men. And they may be made equally in either case to think he is acting right. Character formation hypothesis from Owen. What he's saying is that our characters are formed for us. He's building arguments to justify that, and he's inferring from that that we have no responsibility for our actions or our words, regardless of whether they are benevolent, whether they are neutral, whether they are harmful. So, next thing I'm not going to cover because I just don't have the time, but I just want to note that he is making some arguments as early as 1813 that exclusion of any type is contrary to happiness. And so all this slide does is basically works through his logic on how exclusion basically ends up causing people to harm one another. And what he deduces from this is that we need, as a result, to promote the happiness of all without exception. And what that means is the only method is cooperation. Cooperation being a cordial, other-centered working together by all for the benefit of each. So in his words, good habits must be given to all, or the best cannot be given to any. And what's interesting from an economics perspective is that he understands private property ultimately to be exclusive. Okay. So how do we get to the shaping of a character that would be conducive towards the cooperative mindset? Owen is well known for pretty remarkable contributions that he makes on thoughts about how to educate. All I'm going to do here is briefly summarize the two parts of his rational ethical education program. Ethical piece is that people go through experiential training to explore doing right by others. Experiential training means not indoctrination, because you add to that ethical experiential doing right by others a rational training component, which is the ability to clearly discern facts and to be able to identify truth from falsehood through a reasoning process. So the rational piece apply to situations where different forms of harm or well-being come out, lead people to start to move towards more cooperative types of other beneficial behavior. He gives a few examples in 1813. I'm only going to hit the highlights of the first one. He writes in 1813 that teachers and schools should use every opportunity to link the inseparable connection which exists between the interest and happiness of each individual and the interest and happiness of every other individual, where the student actually explores the outcomes of various behaviors. And then as the student develops the experience, their conviction grows in this truth. So super simple example. Susie goes into school. She's in a bad mood. She bops Johnny up over the head with a stick. Johnny then's crying. Johnny lashes out and bites Susie in the leg. The teacher doesn't punish. The teacher doesn't do anything except say, hey, Susie, pay attention to the facts. Susie, pay attention to the outcomes. What is the situation of well-being when these behaviors unfold? Susie then comes in on another day. Susie goes in, she's in a great mood. She shares her sandwich with Johnny, and then they have an incredible play date together. Again, the teacher's not praising her for her choices. The teacher is just pointing out the facts and then having Susie kind of deduce what is the result for societal welfare when behavior options are working more conducive towards supporting the other person's well-being. Okay, implications of the character formation hypothesis and implying that there's no responsibility for what we do, good or bad, and the rational ethical education program for the social psychology. According to Owen, he builds lots of arguments to try to explain how this will dissolve hatred, revenge, and sincerity, ambition, personal distinction, envy, and jealousy, and how this will elicit compassion, kindness, and benevolence, pure charity, sincere affection for all. The charity that suffers long is kind, does not envy, and is not egotistical. A mutual confidence develops, a sincere desire to promote each other's interest and happiness, and a deep respect for human diversity because no two characters are ever formed alike. Out of this program also, he's a big advocate of not overindulging, and this has important implications for work and for the well-being of the worker. And then he also is advocating that from this system, there is a perfect equality of rights, privileges, and happiness. Okay, we're done with the fundamentals. Now I just want to list out the claims that he's making as to why to cooperate. We'll start with the individual claims and then look at the societal claims. So first of all, assuming that he's right on the original faculties, that we want to unite with what brings us well-being and have an instinct to benefit others, there's internal harmony when we are cooperative. Secondly, there's a reduction in social ills. The obvious personal benefits is that we're less likely to directly experience harm. The other benefit is that if we're empathetic, we're not going to be exposed to as much misery among others. But there's a much deeper interdependence argument. The lack of control in shaping character means there has to be a system-wide improvement to reduce the probability of negative social circumstances developing your own character or developing the character of those that are in your immediate social circle. Beyond this, there should be reduced energy towards hatred and ambition and revenge, which means you've got more energy for constructive engagement. According to Owen, he claims that this will activity in support of others' well-being returns health, strength, vigor to body, and peace of mind. He also claims this is the only path to individual perfection. And oh, by the way, you folks that are involved in the self-interest, narrow self-interest, there's much higher material returns as a way to try to appeal to investors. Cooperation is the mutual confidence and kindness and a sincere desire to promote each other's interest and happiness. This will also, he claims, lead to societal flourishing. In 1833, he writes, everyone's going to partake of the advantages derived from the excellencies of each, and all will therefore feel their happiness to be increased in proportion as each excels in all superior qualifications. But in consequence, all are going to be aiding to enable each individual to acquire and enjoy these benefits that are developing through the system. So, cooperation leads to societal flourishing. The claims that I would love to see the logic built out of the system for is, first of all, removal of societal evils. Secondly, working and living conditions are going to be supportive of whole human development, health returning workplace norms, ample leisure, comfortable standards of living, quality product, and freedom. Superabundance. Now, Owen actually perceives capitalism to be superabundant, even when it's based in narrow self-serving interest. Superabundance, though, of the cooperative system is far beyond that, because people are healthier, because there are incentive effects if you buy into the original faculty's idea, and because instead of only forming 1/10 into rational beings, we're going to be forming 10/10, which is a mine of wealth, almost unopened. Okay, so to summarize, character formation of hypothesis plus Owen's rational ethical education program is all going to feed into a cooperative mindset and a cooperative institutional structure. And this is what, from Owen's perspective, can lead to actual flourishing. Okay, so how do we get there? Transition issues are a huge question, a question that Joe and I will be grappling with in our bigger project. More concretely, he offers this idea of a cooperative village, which never does get realized with the two examples that he tries to work in the 1830s and 1820s. Real quick, transitional requirements, remember that character is formed. And so there needs to be time to mold characters to come to more closely connect with the original faculties. So there's got to be a restructuring of all social institutions, and I'll explain the beginning of the village here in just a minute. Also, already talked about the implications for education. Beyond this, Owen is really emphasizing wise direction by a governing power, and I've got some questions and concerns about this. Prevention, not punishment, when behavior is not panning out. He also has paying well, sharing the bounty, voluntary provisioning of capital, initially with financial returns to the capitalist, and then selective inclusion initially. So those are, so what I want to move to now is the cooperative village. He spends a lot of time and energy thinking about how to start to institute an institutional structure that will reinforce cooperation. He gets really involved in what he refers to as the parallelogram layout of the village. People do have private quarters. Children are raised in dorms. These are on the edge of the parallelogram. There are communal buildings, including kitchen, public gardens, and walkways. Socioeconomic responsibilities are actually divided by age cohort to recognize that people need to be able to be involved in all forms of activity. Early on, you're forming character and assisting with domestic labor. By 10 to 15, you're learning agricultural and industrial skills. 15 to 20-year-olds are the producers as well as the supervisors of the children. The 20 to 25-year-olds are the supervisors. The 25 to 30-year-olds are the distributors. 30 to 40 are the governors of the community. And 40 plus, they're conducting some form of foreign affairs, presumably across villages. The production department in Owens Village, whole human development is the focus, which means temperance and daily exercise of all three parts, no extreme divisions of labor. That said, Owen is really, really pro-technology. Key is that the technology is actually complementing the work process for the quality of the work process for the laborers. Managers are there to wisely organize, direct, and oversee, and somehow they're completely going to be focused on the benefit of the workforce and the community. This does have a class system that's based on capital infusion. The capital provisioners actually have no employment requirements in transition. And after all that village debt is paid, he does mention the possibility of profit sharing, which opens the way for consumer profit sharing and producer worker profit sharing. Distribution department, minimum number of distributors. Mostly what they're doing is storage and conveyance. Think of Amazon, but Amazon done well for the benefit of the consumers and for the benefiters of the distributors, the workers in the warehouses that are engineered to store product in top condition. There's no need for pricing or medium exchange because the system is super abundant. The government department, allegedly protecting the utmost individual freedom of action, but he's got the clause compatible with the permanent good of society. Initially, his system at least is directed by benevolent authorities who infuse capital. Later stages involve appointments to the governing committee, and I'm a little confused about how that works. The governing committee is powerful. For example, they're there to assign and regulate villager employment, giving every regard to what those villagers actually are capable of doing. Ultimately, in the later stages of the cooperative village, as I understand it, there would be no individual reward, no privately held capital or land, but sufficient privacy for anyone that wants it, desirable work processes, and that means work's going to get done, complete freedom of giving and taking, but that's balanced with personal conscientiousness toward those in the community. So you got only so many strawberries, you love strawberries, but you know when you take too many strawberries, there's not enough for others. So that's what is being balanced, is this internal kind of rectifying mechanism, and genuine respect and nurturing. Last thing I want to cover, and I am almost done, is the contradictions and questions. I'm going to keep this real brief to make sure that we have time for to get to Joe's presentation and Andrew's presentation. Contradictions, freedom. There's supposed to be no free will for character development, but freedom is central in the village. And then he's got that freedom qualification, the most freedom compatible with the social good. Hayek and Road to Serfdom would really have problems with that extra clause added on. Who's deciding what's compatible with the social good and what if people disagree? No exclusion is fundamental in 1813, but the village formation stage includes selective entry, and capital infusion gives class position and exemption from work. Cooperation is being led by benevolent authority, but in my kind of limited world, I think cooperation is really more about equals. And then also there's an issue of gradualism and radical transformation, which I'm not going to talk about here. Questions. My big question that I'd love to see if people could build off of is, if people are built as Owen describes, is the system logically coherent? Second question, what happens when altruism is returned with self-centeredness? Owen does have a response, self-sacrifice and redundant supplies of patience, but realistically, does this work when self-centeredness is the response to consistent altruism? Collective action problem. Conversion requires enough people of like mind to start the process. There may be plenty of people that are sympathetic, but if they don't think there's enough people, are they actually going to move to this cooperative system? Next question, is superabundance a prerequisite? Is there sufficient superabundance? Owen clearly thinks superabundance is prerequisite, is actually available at the time of his writing. The question is it correct? And then the last two questions, do original faculties include periodic antipathy to fellow feeling? Owen does have an answer. He says, no, we are indoctrinated into these negative types of interactions with others and negative mindsets because of social hazes. Those are the sources of antipathy. But is he right? And then work incentives. Somehow work is going to become so wonderful that people are just going to be engaged in doing it. The New Harmony outcome, though, was that idealists signed on and nobody was willing to do the hard manual labor. So questions and contradictions need to be worked through to understand the cooperative system, and there are plenty of other people in the 19th and early 20th century that were thinking about that. I am done. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, I liked it. Okay. So this is Joe Persky. I'm gonna share my screen here. All right, let's see if that works. Okay. And of course, this is joint work with Kirsten and Madden. We are working on a larger project. I'm going to be talking about the cooperative economy of Christian socialism. I think you can see there are a lot of connections to Kirsten's presentation, and maybe we'll have a little time at the end to discuss the two of them. So let's see. Christian socialism, it flashes across the British stage, if you will, in the middle of the 19th century. It's short-lived, but what should we say, a brilliant disappointment. Christian socialists see the post-industrial revolution employment relation as fundamentally destructive of individuals and communities. They build an alternative political economy anchored in the theology of F.D. Maurice, and it built on that a theoretical effort largely constructed by John Ludlow, and it represents a serious attempt to describe what a cooperative economics consistent with a Christian understanding of community would look like in the modern industrial age. The group can't agree on Ludlow's fundamental principles, and like the Owenites before them, they're sincere experiments in cooperation in the real world and in abject failure. What's the context of all this? After the Industrial Revolution, there's the rise of a new bourgeois class. These new capitalists are raw. They have virtually none of the traditional historic trappings of English landowners. Many started as workers themselves, interestingly enough, maybe as many as 50%. Most are unwilling to acknowledge their complicity in the spread of urban poverty at the time. And not a few spout the newly minted liberal ideology of competition, and most practice religion, although perhaps from a hypocritical perspective, a religion that promotes worker discipline and subservience. And here are three classic examples: Richard Arkwright, the famous inventor, John Brown, the head of the Atlas Iron Works, and Samuel Gregg from Quarry Bank Mills. You can see him on prime time, even as we speak. There's a series on prime time about Quarry Bank Mills. But of course, there was an alternative view of religion, one that saw the Bible, in the words of Charles Kingsley, a prominent Christian socialist, as instead of being a book to keep the poor in order, is a book from beginning to end, I'm quoting him, written to keep the rich in order. It is full of the most awful warnings and restrictions to the rich. It is the poor man's comfort and the rich man's warning. And from this alternative understanding, from this alternative understanding, the Christian socialists are ready to open a cooperative theology. They're going to take advantage of this alternative view. In that alternative, it's easy to identify the new industrial bourgeoisie as interlopers who have lost touch with Christian virtues. Most damning, the factories reduce workers to a commodity and virtually deny their underlying humanity. In opposition to this ungodly selfishness, the Christian socialists are going to look to a new understanding of a gospel of cooperation. The key theological point is that God intends and people are capable of building a cooperative heaven on earth, what Maurice calls Christ's kingdom. Who are these Christian socialists that take up this challenge? What do they have in common? They're from diverse family backgrounds. They're not from the working class, most of them, although they tried to join up with working class allies. They're from Orthodox churches, dissenting churches, two lawyers, a second son of the landed gentry, and far-flung, interestingly, imperial adventurers from India and the Caribbean. Here's the cast of characters, the major characters. Notice it could be a play. They're so interesting. Maurice, Anglican theologian from a Unitarian family, experiencing some economic declines. His family almost breaks up when he becomes an Anglican. John Ludlow, lawyer, the main theoretician of the group, born in India, raised in France. He loans the inheritance he has to his brother-in-law and loses it. E.V. Neal down in the corner here, a lawyer who inherits a major fortune and indeed becomes the supporter of many of the working associations the group sets up. Charles Kingsley, again, a cleric, but also famous as an author, from a family who prospered in the British Caribbean and suffered economically from emancipation. Thomas Hughes, a second son, famous author of Tom Brown's School Days. Again, you can see it on the streaming. and an MP described by all as both decent and charming. Certainly a funny kettle of fish. What do they have in common? They're drawn together by Maurice's sincere religion, an open and non-punitive interpretation of the gospel. They're all well-educated in a society increasingly characterized by upward mobility. Their life suggests somewhat exposed class positions and a smack, if you will, for several of downward mobility. They rely on the earnings of previous generations and do not themselves participate actively in the expanding industrial opportunities of the new age. They all share a sense that the world is out of sorts. From these ambiguous class positions, avoiding the opportunities perhaps available, they turn instead toward the truths of religion. Chief among these truths for them is the dignity of a community of grace and cooperation, with an emphasis on the word community. Moving men and women in such directions provides meaning and purpose to their lives. And so they come together around the sense of Maurice's theology. Maurice at the time is a chaplain at Lincoln's Inn, where Ludlow practices. Ludlow himself, who has relatives still living in France, his two sisters, is caught up in the Revolution of 1848 in France, visits, doesn't participate in the revolution, but participates in the energy. He's impressed by the work of Louis Blanc in spreading cooperation during the revolution. Ludlow writes of this to Maurice. He writes a letter that becomes a bond, has a major influence on Maurice, and becomes a bond that holds the two men together in their search for reform. In France, Ludlow is influenced again by Louis Blanc, but also by Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, both of whom are theoreticians, if you will, of cooperation. They bring together the group of actors that I described before, and what we see then is some early achievements of really impressive scope. They set up the society, and this all happens very quickly. They set up the Society for the Promotion of Working Men's Association. They meet regularly to try and build understanding between middle and working class elements. The demise of Chartism, which is just about occurred just about this time, leaves an opening for expansion of cooperative ideas among reform-minded workers. By June of 1850, they only start in the early 1850. By June, there are 8 workers' cooperative associations up and running. They publish a manifesto in the form of tracts on Christian socialism that's jointly authored by several of them. Ludlow, in an impressive move, obtains new legal status for workers' associations through Parliament, granting a start toward limited liability. Interestingly, in this, he's supported by John Stuart Mill. Mill and the principals reports some of these activities. But just as they have early successes, they have early difficulties, so that the heavy dependence perhaps on Neil's funding to get the associations going, Ludlow sees it as undermining self-reliance and attracting what he calls, or what he says the French call the déclassé. Much to the chagrin of the council, several associations fall to internal quarreling, while the managers of 2 disappear with association funds. A promising effort to encourage cooperation among the members of the Amalgamated Society of Engineers, the largest English union at the time, comes to naught. Maurice faces serious problems as the result of his leadership of the Christian Socialists and his unorthodox religious ideas, resulting in his dismissal from his major position at King's College in 1853. So against, those are the successes, those are the problems, but what goes on at the same time is the construction of a theory of Christian socialist cooperation. It starts actually with Maurice's social psychology that emphasizes free will in opposition to Owen's emphasis on conditioning that we just heard about. For Maurice, he rejects biblical interpretations that allow perpetual damnation for sin, and perhaps this is from his Unitarian background. Sin is its own punishment, a willful alienation from and rejection of both God and our fellow human beings. Such rebellious alienation glorifies, well, you won't be surprised, glorifies selfishness, the selfishness of the competitive economy, perhaps. Our longing for a union with God can only be meaningful in a communion with our fellow human beings. Separation, isolation, extreme individualism, and selfishness are ultimately social sins. Christ and Christ's kingdom replaces selfishness right here on earth. This is supposed to happen in the here and now with a cooperative community and must be governed by concert and not by competition. All right, so that's the social psychology. On that is built a theoretical superstructure or structure. Maybe it's best realized in a debate between Ludlow and William Rathbone Gregg, the son of the Samuel Gregg that we saw the picture of before, and here's William, of Quarry Bank Mills. He's an inheritor of the mills, but he himself is primarily an essayist, and he sets out an attack on the Christian socialist position. He wants to defend the political economists. He explicitly says this against the Christian socialists. And he asserts all schemes of social amelioration which violate the principles of economic science must come to naught. Providence makes no shortcuts. And he says we have to be worried because these clergymen of high literary reputation threaten to make socialism respectable. God forbid. So he builds an attack. He asserts that the Christian socialists have nothing to offer the poor but a return to a system of medieval guilds. They laud a long-gone system that's based on concert rather than competition, but concert can't efficiently match, according to Gregg, supply and demand. It has no replacement for the machinery of trial and error embodied in the competitive marketplace. Sectors that yield high profits will be expanded, and those that return little or no profits are contracted. That's the essence of competition. Any effort to interfere with this fundamental competitive process can lead only to inefficiency and economic retrogression. Continuing the attack. In practice, the Christian socialists offer only a co-partnership of workers, a firm under another name, operating in a competitive marketplace. At most, these cooperatives perhaps erase the profits of middlemen. If, as some Christian socialists anticipate, the various associations grow into one vast guild, then what will emerge will no longer be competition, but, says Greg, will be monopoly. Monopoly, artificial prices, a restricted market, a gigantic job, a final and inevitable smash. And here are a couple of quotes that summarize his position. The advocates of association as a cure for competition are caught between two horns of a dilemma. In case you have many associations, you retain all the evils of competition. In case you merge them all into one, you encounter all the evils of monopoly. The only possible escape from the dilemma can come from a, quote, remodeling of human nature by divine or Christian influences. But, says Greg, if such a remodeling can be achieved, all systems will become indifferent, for the evils of all systems will be wiped away. In response to Greg's attack, Ludlow puts together his political economy of cooperation. It starts with concert. Concert is practical. Ludlow gives major examples. He points to the social elements of society that use concert. The government, the public services, the military all use concert to solve economic problems. And at all productive organizations, especially these large companies that are emerging, internally depend on concert to align the demand for labor with its supply, internally within the organization, anticipating some modern labor economics there. Ludlow maintains that inefficiencies characterize competition, not efficiencies. Despite political economy's claims, competition fails to efficiently balance labor supply with demand. 2, competitors hide private knowledge while inefficient firms and occupations are long maintained. And 3, competing workers, knowing only one skill, cannot leave. He's thinking of slop shop workers at the time. Instead, they turn to supplement their labor with that of their wives and children. On the other hand, concert shows us efficiency. Cooperation supports shared knowledge and transparency. Cooperation excludes unnecessary middlemen and provides gains to both workers and consumers. Checking the time, I'm going to just skip over the discussion of wages, but I note here that Seligman in 1886 recognized Ludlow in his passages on wages as he met the economists on, this is a quote, on their own ground. Here for the first time do we find a successful refutation of the wage fund theory, an interesting claim for the Christian socialists. The cooperative firm is fundamentally different from the competitive firm, despite Greg's claims. The differences center on sharing of profits in the cooperative firm, which does away with exploitation, and accepting the need, which they do, of skilled supervision, but that skilled supervision, the foreman, etc., are going to be chosen through democratic powers of appointment. Okay, finally, Ludlow asserts that the various associations will work in concert through a central board composed of representatives of all the associations. The regulation of this board will aim to prevent either monopoly or unfair competition. Asks the reader, his reader, to envision a small isolated town in which each trade is represented by a single craftsperson. Each of these then has a monopoly in their trade, but each is constrained by the potential or actual combination of all their fellows. Association of associations can achieve a harmonious balance among the various trades. It is a monopoly, but it is the monopoly of all order and justice against all iniquity and disorder. It is the monopoly of fair prices and living wages against false prices and starvation wages. This argument, most importantly, fails to carry Maurice himself. Ludlow's political economy is ambitious, innovative, and challenging. But concert for Ludlow's political economy is achieved through hierarchy and institutional structure. Maurice balks. He asserts that such a system is itself manipulative. It is not based directly on social cooperation. Rather, it attempts to incentivize and harness evil forces, this hierarchy, inequality, that ultimately must undermine meaningful equality. The political economists were foolish to assert that the competitive system could bring good from evil. This is a fundamental point to Maurice. But the cooperative movement, too, must avoid the trap of thinking that it can bring good from evil. A true Christian socialism must be decentralized, self-organizing, and virtue-based. Maurice essentially is disillusioned about the possibilities. His competition is at best built on a vain attempt to channel the evils of jealousy and greed for social purposes. Accepting God requires us to shun such efforts. A mature acceptance of God brings forth the human material ready for the decentralized workers' associations of the sociable kingdom of Christ. Maurice comes to fear that British workers had not yet reached this level of religious maturity. Without it, cooperatives could not achieve their deep social purpose. Maurice turns away towards working men's colleges. He founds the Working Men's College in 1854. It continues to the present day. Hughes, Ludlow, Neal, and Kingsley participate actively in it, as do Dante Gabriel Rossetti, John Ruskin, John Stuart Mill. Also, nevertheless, Ludlow, Neal, and Hughes remain active and become stalwarts of the cooperative movement in England in the late 19th century. However, Christian socialism never again generates such a deep political economy. Thanks for your time. I think we've got a little time for questions now. Maybe Kirsten could also open her microphone. Let me stop sharing. Okay.
Hello. Okay.
So I see some Q&A here. Let's see what they're hitting. Can you see that, Kirsten?
Yeah, I've got it. So I'll read it and then we'll see if we can answer or just hold these off. We have about 6 or 7 minutes. So Haro Mas asks, can you expand a bit about the difference of Owen's molding characters and Bentham's? More in particular, how do the two first original faculties differ from Bentham's springs of human action, pleasure, and pain? If character is formed for, not by, then an internal act of thinking seems to me difficult to conceive. Yeah, so I don't know if Joe can answer the question about comparison to Bentham, but I was basically looking at this as the kind of an acceptance of the attraction aversion thing that was coming out of Bentham's ideas. Bentham was one of the supporters of the financial backers of New Lanark. I agree with you on if the character is formed, then an internal act of thinking seems to me difficult to conceive. I'm not sure I'm understanding the question, but I think that Owen would probably argue that all thought is also kind of predetermined. And I don't know if that's answering your question or not, but that's the best I can do. Joe, do you have anything to add on Haro's?
It's a way to approach and stimulate thinking in the individuals. Ultimately, they do internalize the social aspect and can reason about it. Reason is still for Owen, a major component of personality, even if it has been formed.
And
I
perhaps
don't
we
know
should
if
look a
that's-
little bit at Bentham as it feeds into Owen, because they didn't necessarily agree on everything, but I have not looked at that element of interaction of the thinkers on Owen's thought. The second question is, yesterday we had Laura Valdeo's presentation on Mill and feminism, and she mentioned his concept of ethology, which is the study of character. It was surprising that Owen also had a study of character. He didn't name it plasticity. I named it that, so just need to correct that. It's also interesting that he had a study of character that I've named plasticity. Was there any relationship between Owen and Mill in this? If they read each other, or was study of character something trendy in the 19th century? Joe, you got anything to add on the Mill?
Yeah, no, ethology, I mean, it is the part of Mill that he never quite finished, sort of his broader social science. And Owen is the founder, if you will, of social science. I mean, it's his idea. And so I'm sure Mill for sure has read Owen. Owen read relatively little, as far as I can tell. You know, he read some of the 18th century stuff, the Enlightenment stuff. But Mill for sure had read Owen, was very interested in this idea of social science. And Mill himself offers social psychology for his endorsement of cooperatives based on workers developing independence and greater education. So I think there is a strain. I don't know about trendy, but there is a strain that does run through the 19th century where character is extremely important, and the fear that the character that is being nourished by the competitive marketplace is somehow not the character we really want to build. And both Owen and the Christian socialists and some of the other people that Kirsten and I are looking at are trying to build a political economy that could be based on another character if it can be achieved.
Yes, and I do also agree the study of character, I do think, was something that's popping throughout this time frame. What's interesting for me is that, like, moving forward, Owen has a big effect on The Economist, an early magazine that was reflecting the ideas of John Gray and George Moody and so forth. And when you're reading those early issues of this early version, the discussions are very much centered on the idea of no free will, of being shaped, and so he has an effect on a number of people.
Yeah, I think also, just with respect to the Christian socialists here, the idea of character, they have the advantage of feeling that individuals have a little piece of God in them, and that's the character that has to be pulled out, if you will, and in the social context, it will come forward. So I think we're almost on time.
Yeah, we got through. Does anybody, anything else?
I think we're okay.
Or shall we move over to
Andrew.
Andrew?
You there, Andrew?
Yes,
Okay.
I am there. Can you guys hear me? Does it sound all right? Oh,
Oops.
okay. All right. Well, thank you. That was I really enjoyed that presentation, and I'm really glad to have the opportunity to talk to everyone today about the social harmonies, or the harmonies doctrine school. Just a little bit about myself. I'm a sociologist interested in the history of ideas. I'm speaking to you today from the University of Virginia in the United States. And this project represents something that came out of my dissertation. It was a sort of unsettled part of tracing through the history of ideas and realizing that there was more work to be done in what I was looking at. And so I'll go ahead and share my screen so you can see. I have a few slides for you, not very many, but okay, and start. So, so you should be able to see my screen now. So what I'm going to talk about today is the Harmony Doctrine School, the Harmony School. It goes by different names, but I just want to lay out sort of some of the history and the central ideas there. And then I'm excited to hear from others. I'm really interested in this idea of harmonies in economic thinking, and sort of the different sources of it, the different understandings of it, the way that sort of philosophical ideas from the Enlightenment, from Christian theology, work their way into economic thinking, and then the ways that it persists today. If we have time, what you're going to see is, I'm still at heart a sociologist, so I want to get to a little bit of where these ideas now are in our society today, so looking at the persisting influence, as I said in the title. But I also know among historians, I'm sure that you want to talk about history. So, so let's start there. So I'll get into the presentation here. I'm calling it the Harmony Doctrine School, is led by, just to give you an overview, led by characters like Frederick Bastiat and Henry Charles Carey. This school is mainly known for deriving from the nature of reality assurances about natural harmonies governing relationships and constituencies contending over resources. In a period when much of the economic discipline was moving in other directions toward psychological accounts of action, toward mathematical proofs, the harmony doctrine thinkers, I would argue, doubled down on their philosophical and even theological precepts. They therefore carved out a different wing of economics than the ones that I think really sort of came out in all their glory at the end of the 19th century. So the Harmony Doctrine thinkers located the economic realm within a holistic moral cosmology, composed of metaphysically charged forces that worked in benevolent ways toward achieving ethical ends. And such a view, I argue, has predecessors in the classical school, as well as some other schools that we will look at. So there's a little bit of overlap with what we've heard earlier. This is definitely not a mode of economics that prides itself in being value neutral or scientific. This is a way of thinking about economics that intersects with moral themes in a way that I think is really interesting. So recovering this somewhat forgotten school provides insights into how our ethical discourse is shaped around market economics and the ways they approach ethics. Other schools of economics appeal to utilitarian calculus, faith in Wallacean equilibriums, or other means of achieving the common good through market exchanges. But what I want to look at here is the very specific ways the Harmony Doctrine has returned to a teleological or even providential vision of the natural order that has largely fallen out of favor in the economic discipline. So I have a slide here just sort of at where I'm pulling this from, but different economic historians do use this term. There's not strong agreement on who's in the school, but I'll talk about that in a minute. But you can see it overlaps with the French liberal school and is also at times called the optimist school. Just to show you where I'm going, so after providing a brief overview of the historical developments of the school, I map out three key features of how they approach ethics and economics, and you can see here. The three key features are, first, they convert all institutional political configurations into a concept of social naturalism, which I'll talk about. Two, they infer from the inherent characteristics of economic exchanges a social order characterized by largely cooperative, harmonious relations. And three, they promote an ethical naturalism that makes superfluous or redundant all ethical criteria or ends outside those that are naturally occurring in nature. So this last feature provides a fairly radical conclusion. The needed interventions or responses to cases of socially harmful behavior are not ethical correctives, but educational correctives. that point would-be offenders in ethics toward improved understandings of the harmonious order of nature. They specifically went after people like Owen. They went after other, they called them communism or communist thinkers for trying to correct what should not or could not be corrected. So we'll talk about that in a minute. Here's the, just to give you the economic context of where this came from. The Harmonious Doctrine School came onto the scene in the early 19th century. One of the precursors to this school, who's sometimes lumped into the school itself, is Jean-Baptiste Say, who first made a name for himself in interpreting and developing Adam Smith's thinking. Moving in the opposite directions of his contemporaries, Malthus and Ricardo, Say's economics made the case for corrective, equilibrating forces, even in places where Smith and others had predicted troubling disequilibria. Those who came after Say in the French liberal school replicated Say's faith in laissez-faire, but not really his theoretical innovativeness. Most of these other thinkers that we'll look at would only play minor roles in the development of economics ideas. But Say is recognized as serving as an important conduit for preserving the more dogmatic laissez-faire thinking of the 18th century French physiocrats with 19th century economics, an influence which would otherwise be tempered by Adam Smith. Economic historian Charles Guide was first to say Say and his French liberal descendants represent the optimist school, identifying among them, and here's a list that I've not included but is important, identifying among them Frédéric Bastiat, Italian thinker Francesco Ferrara, and adding to the mix British economist John Ramsay McCulloch, Nassau Williams Sr., and John Eliot Cairns. Guide notes that the English members of the school lacked some of the same optimism of the French members, and that's why we're not talking about them today. And of course, these lists are hardly authoritative, but we're mostly going to talk about the two figures that I've put here. So one thinker that's universally placed in this school is American economist Henry Charles Carey, lived from 1793 to 1879. Carey was a laissez-faire enthusiast, but became a protectionist later in his life, who identified his intellectual opponents the same that the optimist school targeted. Carey's thought resembled Bastiat's so closely that there were accusations that Bastiat plagiarized him, and this was settled really after Bastiat's death, and there's still disputes about whether there was plagiarism. But the important thing I want to bring out is both Karl Marx and Joseph Schumpeter lumped these two figures together as representing a very unique way of thinking. Marx sees Bastiat, which we'll get to, as the other pole to John Stuart Mill. So he sees him as a dominant figure, although Marx thought horribly of Bastiat. He has very sort of devastating insults of his actual thinking. He sees him as an influential thinker in his time. So Carey had quite the academic pedigree. His father, Matthew Carey, was one of America's first well-known economists and a close political associate of Benjamin Franklin. And Carey inherited a publishing firm and was able to retire from business early and then just start writing for the next 4 decades. And he eventually ends up being the chief economic advisor to Abraham Lincoln. Bastiat, we'll see here, on the other hand, has a different life. He's an orphan by age 9, cared for by his extended family. He was not able to pursue a formal education past 17, but he did inherit at 24 sufficient wealth from a relative's death to support his desire to learn and master several different subjects. He failed at several trades. He became a politician. He tried to join a war effort, but he soon became interested in the anti-corn movements of the 1930s in Britain and tried to bring that movement to French economic journals. His publishing career is short. He gets his first article to land in 1844. He dies of tuberculosis in 1850, but in that time he publishes a lot of works that make their way around the economic field. Americans, I will say, have revived Bastiat because they see him as an important character in the libertarian movement. So when I present this work to primarily American audiences, some of them have read Bastiat's essay on the law, which has been sort of elevated in libertarian circles. So Carey and Bastiat's central works, published in a period between 1835 and 1860, capture the core of the Harmony Doctrine school. Their work must be placed in the specific context of economic thought of that time, which we'll talk about. I guess we'll go back to this slide. So they're both coming in the post-Ricardian age, and I'll argue that Malthus and Ricardo had moved beyond Smith's framework in significant ways, pulling the classical tradition away from sort of the holistic vision of liberalism and the Scottish Enlightenment influences of Smith. I probably don't have time to defend any of these claims, so I'll just say that we'll talk a little bit about Malthus and Ricardo. They both saw natural forces which had effectively placed limits on the available resources to address the social plight that they were seeing in their time. And they both spoke in fairly fatalistic terms. Malthus, of course, arguing that starvation was haunting the growing poverty. And Malthus' analysis warranted not interfering with poverty, starvation, and vice, as these were deemed characteristics necessary for restoring and preserving equilibrium in the system. So this is a rather gloomy take on economics. Ricardo's synthesis tread a similar path. Here, too, was an analysis of abstract economic forces operating behind the backs of economic actors. As in Malthus, the institutional or humanistic factors of Smith's account played a much smaller supporting role in determining the relationships of land, wages, and wealth. Ricardo and his followers were slightly more optimistic regarding the outcomes of these naturally occurring forces, though Ricardo's vision also saw equilibrating forces as incapable of achieving harmony among contending political classes. But both of them essentially occupied this place of independent economic analysis. They, in words of one historian, stood away from and above the social flux and with an impersonal eye plotted the direction of its current. The Harmony Doctrine School, at least methodologically, adopts a very similar position. John McCulloch, a figure that Gunnar Myrdal places at the forefront of the Harmony Doctrine School, was recognized as one of the leading Ricardian disciples in the age of Ricardo, generally between 1850 and 1848. Yet McCulloch's celebration of Ricardo's laissez-faire principles, a conclusion that Ricardo himself seemed to arrive at only indirectly and with a great degree of reluctant fatalism, effectively served as a disciplinary on-off-ramp for this school. With most of the economics theory through the 19th century would work to slowly sift out some of the remaining naturalism of Ricardo and those who came before them, the Harmony Doctrine School moved in the opposite direction. Rather than engage utilitarianism, the growing influence of Comtean positivism, or the marginalism that would emerge at the end of the 19th century, that Harmony Doctrine thinkers effectively anchored their economics within a natural or providential vision of social order, rich with theological and spiritual underpinnings. Three central premises that I mapped out before lay these out, and we'll start with the first one here. So the first feature that I want to talk about is the what I call the social naturalism. This is an unwavering confidence that the regularities observed in the economic realm are governed by laws of nature. This naturalism is not the same naturalism that was promoted by 20th century positivism, which asserted that because both the natural and social world exhibit similar characteristics, the social realm should be studied with the same methods as the natural realm. But there's also many other types of naturalism that has to be distinguished from. Rather, as Fred Bloch and Margaret Summers argue in their critical assessment of economic history, social naturalism asserts, quote, society is not like, but is a biological entity, and it is thus subject to biological laws of nature rather than to institutional rules and social rationality. Thus, we see Bastiat speak of the laws of political economy as governing the moral world, just as the law of equilibrium governs the material one. But importantly, this naturalism is not a closed-up materialism or a physicalism. Bastiat, in particular, preserves a more providentially grounded vision of a natural order that animated the early thought of the French physiocrats. Thus, Bastiat puts his faith in self-leveling laws of political economy. Evidence of the providential wisdom which presides over the equalizing governments in society. So this creates two high priorities in this system. The first one being self-corrective forces can be both self-correcting forces must both analytically explain and metaphysically correct all would-be imperfections in the system. The second claim is that a suitably natural explanation for all features of economic life must not account for institutional factors or variation. We'll talk about that second one in a minute. For the first claim, Bastiat replicates many of the same ideas of the French physiocrats. He located within the social body of society the same curative forces found in the human body. Both sorts of forces would be entrusted to achieve the gradual diminution of disturbances, diminution of disturbances to governing laws. In the case of the economic realm, the disturbances of evil. With these forces then presumed efficacious, Bastiat is not dismayed by the presence of plunder in an economic system, which he defines as services obtained by force or fraud. So he says, quote, harmony does not consist in absolute absence of evil, but in a gradual reduction. The naturally correcting tendencies play a central role in preserving the natural order and working out this evil. So I'll just have two quotes here. Each good decision brings its own reward, just as each error brings about its own correction. An experience, that cuffed teacher of foresight at least fulfills its mission in such a way that society cannot fail to be improved. Here's your second quote. The social body, like the human one, is provided with a curative force, whose laws and infallible power cannot be studied without the cry still being uttered. Here is the hand of God. The second point I'll hit more quickly. They have a naturalistic understanding of economic entities that take part in economic exchanges. This, of course, departs from the sort of proto-institutional thinking. John Stuart Mill, that we just heard about, had been heavily influenced by the British institutionalist thinkers of his time. Adam Smith had also spoken of the institutional and legal forms, particularly looking at the corporate charters that were emerging with the joint stock corporations. Smith saw reason to be concerned with these sorts of institutional developments and forms of law that were interfering with the market. But what I want to bring out here is these institutional factors do not register in Carey and Bastiat's vision, despite their ability to observe an even more influential role of corporations and joint stocks in the economy they observed. Carey saw the railroad trust of his time as emerging not from the introduction of government charters, but instead representing, quote, the brotherhood of man translated into the partnership of business. So absent in this writing is any scrutiny of institutions, ways of thinking about corporate charters, and one of the things that they do bring out is the natural versus artificial. Bastiat speaks of the artificial modes of government and organization promoted by Rousseau, but then he turns and promotes and praises the joint stock associations for their ability to naturally unite man's power and afford the smallest capitals the opportunity of taking part in the most extensive industry. So where Smith saw an unnatural defection from laissez-faire competition, Bastiat could only see the advancement of the natural order. We'll move to the second one because I know I don't want to get behind time here, which is both thinkers here saw a harmonious social ontology. They wanted to uncover the beautiful social order. And this puts an optimistic faith in an underlying harmony that undergirds their vision of economics. This is not present in Ricardo, of course, who observed a bottleneck in the production of wealth derived by the division of labor, thereby breaking with some of the more optimistic interpretations. A quote from Ricardo, the interest of landlords is always opposed to the interest of every other class community. This has already been recognized in Smith, who also criticized the rentier class that reaps where they have never sown, in gaining profits from the work of laborers. So Ricardo and Smith have much more conflict versus Carey and Bastiat work through, particularly Malthus and Ricardo's thought, and construct arguments that essentially eliminate these sorts of conflicts. One of their key moves is restoring landowners and capitalists as equal and honorable participants in division of labor, wiping away the criticisms of Smith, Ricardo, and the later criticisms of Marx. As most economic historians narrate, the underlying episteme of the political economy of the 19th century, particularly in British thought, or how they do this, is they start moving toward accounts of the social life that see a social harmony undergirding how society works. And this is in line with the movement of the 19th century, which is attempting to create a vision of the social life without making explicit appeals to metaphysical presuppositions. So let's see, I don't want to get behind, but this also means that they do not take up very much interest in the utilitarianism that's developing at the time. But this is skipping ahead here. But what permeates Carey and Bastiat's thinking is instead a faith in a cosmological harmony that seems to be spilling over into the relationships and regularities that were only recently made visible by their new discipline of political economics. So I just want to say one more thing about how these harmonies work. They both put faith in cosmological order, and this is achieved as humans work in harmony with providential laws. I think I have this quote, or two quotes from Bastiat. Man, having been given both a will and a free choice, it is certain that the beneficial laws of providence are advantageous to him insofar as he conforms to them. And you can see another quote here where he's waving off Ricardo's conflictual divisions and others, of course, the growing movements of socialism, and saying that capitalists and workers don't be looking at each other with suspicion. You have common interests at hand. You can both work together for the common good. And if I had more time, Carey makes a very interesting opposition to Homo economicus, as saying this is too much a competitive vision of man as trader, man as exchanger, and talks about how the harmonies even knock down the emerging doctrine of Homo economicus. But let's move to the third one, which is ethical naturalism that renders superfluous the exogenous ethical criteria. And here we're going to engage a little bit of Owen, which we've heard about before. So Bastiat makes clear in several places that ethical considerations for equality, public rights, or justice are simply not necessary in places characterized by economic exchanges. Such considerations are not only redundant, but even inferior to the natural laws of political economy. In his discussion of the laws of competition, which is very different from what we heard from the Christian socialists, he claims to recount social arrangements that exceeds the vision of the many reformers of his day, whether Saint-Simon, Fourier, or Owen, as the law of competition produces a commonism regulated by infinite providence and not abandoned to the weakness, the passions, and the follow of man. This is perhaps one of the most significant departures between Adam Smith and the harmony doctrine thinkers, as even Smith's more agentic account of moral sentiments is not subordinate to the laws of political economy. Bastiat warns of a certain kind of sentimental philanthropy that can misdirect would-be reformers to find natural organizations of society insufficient or unjust. These misguided sentimentalists are guilty of projecting false antagonisms between classes, such as between proprietary and proletariat, capital and labor, the producer and the consumer, etc. Bastiat judges any such judgments of this sentimental philanthropy as wedging false antagonisms between liberty and harmony. What Bastiat lands at instead is crucial to his understanding of ethics and economics. Moral judgments should not be imposed upon the interlinking relationships within the economy, which we have already seen are governed by internal mechanisms put in place, quote, by the same great mind which put harmony in the movement of the celestial bodies. Such judgments violate Bastiat's vision of a simple harmony of interest ideas, which he declares visible through the economic sphere. It can be found in, quote, the various branches of industry, the harmony of classes, of nations, even of doctrines. This principle effectively allows men to labor, to exchange, to learn, to associate, to act and react on each other in a manner that cannot fail to produce, and this is a quote, order, harmony, progress, good, and better still. So I have some quotes from how Gunnar Myrdal sees this as sort of the return or sort of the preservation of natural law within economics. But I'll move forward to just questions of where these doctrines of the harmony doctrine endure today. One of the things that I would bring out is particularly in popular thinking about how economics influences society. There's a large focus upon the association with neoclassical economics and the Chicago School. And one of the things that discourse typically points to is assumptions of market actors as utility maximizers, They operate from a stable set of preferences. They obtain satisfaction, and they're constantly confronting trade-offs and scarcity. So many of the voices in these conversations speak of economics portraying a cold, calculative utilitarianism, injecting market rationality and unfettered egoism across the social order. And this would include Wendy Brown's work on neoliberalism, which sees this sort of economics creeping into the social sphere, overcoming democracy, and these types of things. But what I want to look at with this Harmony School is the way that these ideas represent a different mode of economic thinking that is popular within American discourse today, and wider Western discourse. So if we do just one more historical side here, there is a movement really right around the beginning of the 20th century where a lot of harmony thinking starts seeping into these other modes of thinking, particularly through the progressive era. And what you see is the idea that politics and conflict of interest, whether one's thinking in terms of class or other sorts of conflicts in society, can somehow be circumvented in ways that sort of bring to the surface these sort of natural harmonies. So I put some examples there of different doctrines that seem to be recreating or at least latching themselves to modes of harmony. Most of these I'm still exploring in detail, but I'll land here with where I think the primary home of the harmony doctrine thinking is today, which is in managerial discourse. And this is where my prior work and my dissertation sort of got started, which was looking at the ways that people now talk about corporate capitalism. And so I'll read you some quotes that really sort of triggered this project, because without understanding the Harmony School, I really could not make sense of these quotes. So a university-produced video on ethical corporation said, "Profit and ethical behavior are no longer mutually exclusive in the business world. They go hand in hand." And a 2017 Forbes magazine article said, "We're reaching a pivotal moment in history at which business needs to incorporate social good in order to stay competitive." And then here's a quote from a management textbook. "Let me be clear," the author says, "there is no conflict between serving all your stakeholders and providing excellent return for shareholders. It is impossible to have one beyond the other." And then Michael Porter at Harvard has a quote, "Business and society have been pitted against each other for too long." And what all of these authors tend to think about is trade-offs, which is something that the Harmony Doctrine thinkers thought of as well. And they don't like trade-offs, and they deny that trade-offs are there. And so I really am keying in on the way that this resistance to trade-offs in economics, which is primary in other modes of economics, is really disappearing from some of this discourse around business today. So I'll just end with this one paragraph. Writers of the modern texts on business may appeal against different intellectual opponents than Bastiat and Carey were. They're likely not fending off reform proposals grounded in the principles of Owenism that we heard about earlier, or Fourierism, or other modes of socialism. But today we see them land in a remarkably similar place as the early Harmony Doctrine thinkers. They see their task as not so much developing and exercising moral judgments to resolve the ethical conflicts that one finds within economics, but instead working to deny the existence and salience of such conflicts altogether. Their solutions then have very little to say about the ethical deliberation of ends, as they seem to instead promote a more cognitive corrective in understanding and perceiving the ways that business and economics functions. So these writings are essentially calls to a conversion, not to a new moral order, but a new way of understanding and seeing reality, one that I think ties just as well to a sort of theological and metaphysical view of the universe. So I know I've gone over time there, probably apologize for, I enjoy talking about the sort of cultural dimension of it. But I'll go to questions now. If I'm leaving anything out, feel free to jump in. So it looks like I only have a few minutes for questions, but so I'll read this one aloud. I have two following questions. I'm very interested in Owen's idea. Is this the right question? Oh, no, this is not the question. These are the old questions. Okay, well, I guess there's time for questions. My screen is not showing any at the moment. So, but if there are any, I'd be willing to take them. Or if there's any sort of general wrap up on the panel as a whole, we can do that as well.
Andrew, this is Joe.
Yeah.
Could you say a couple words about Carey and especially his protectionism? How does that fit?
So thank you for asking. This is very, I'm going to try to do the best that I can because this is very confusing. Carey is very passionate about protecting his pure idea of natural exchanges and natural harmonies. And I think he comes pretty clear that he just absolutely abhors contaminating economics with systems that he sees as cheating at economics. And so I think the man really hates British people for some reason. He says these British economists and their economy that they've created should not be allowed to really contaminate the ways that our laissez-faire mode of economics is operating in a way that's more pure and more in line with the natural laws of economics. So it is very strange to find that he's a protectionist, and yet the way that I'm seeing him is the same way that these economic historians are seeing him, as he's a big defender of laissez-faire economics. But I think his protectionism is coming from, this has to stay so pure that we actually have to protect it from those breaking the rules. So that's my best take on it, but it is a very strange phenomenon.
Okay.
All right, well, it's 11:30. I don't know if we have someone to close the panel, or we should just go ahead and close it off.
Good. Yeah. I think it's time to go home.
Okay.
We do have one question in the queue. It's from Yui, so I've screenshotted it. Joe and I know Yui, so we will address it. It has to do with the influences and interconnections between Owen and Mill. And what did Owen think about the superabundance of socialism? Owen thought the superabundance of cooperation, which I think is different from socialism, that would far exceed capitalism's superabundance. I have not seen socialism in these early days. He wouldn't have had anything to go on for what I assume you're thinking of as socialism of the 20th century. So that's the best I can do on the second question. So.
Good. I really liked both of the other presentations.
Yeah, this was fun. Thank you very much, Andrew. And
thanks to the audience.
If we have no more questions, I know that Amy has to get on to the setup of the next presentation, which is coming up. And so I want to thank all of us for actually pulling this together for the virtual HES. And thanks to the 22 who popped in as participants, of which a bunch of you are still left. Sorry, we can't actually see you. This is a little bit disconcerting, but this has been very cool. And I want to thank HES, particularly Amy, for managing all of this and allowing us the opportunity to be able to share ideas. This has been it's been a cool experience. We may be having more conferences like this coming up in the next couple of years. So get ready for the new world, people. Okay, shall we sign off?